let's turn, if you don't mind, let's turn to chapter 2, which is that there are two sexes. So I want to, again, ask you a relatively complicated question in that regard. So one of the striking facts of human perception and conception is the primacy of sexual differentiation. So the first thing I would say about that is that sex emerged about 750 million years ago. So it's a very, very old phenomenon, and it's very fundamental. I mean, sex emerged, at least in part, to ensure that creatures could stay ahead of their parasites. And I won't go into that in any great detail, but it turns out that sexual reproduction is more effective as a multi-generational strategy than parthenogenesis, because creatures could, in principle, just produce identical copies of themselves. But that turns out not to be biologically effective. And so sex is very fundamental. Now, one of the things that implies is that the ability to differentiate sexually is also of fundamental significance, because creatures that fail to do that don't find a mate. And so that's that on the evolutionary side. And so even creatures that don't have a nervous system can differentiate practically and functionally between the sexes. But there's more to it, Vivek, as far as I can tell, is that the notion of sexual differentiation as a primal fact of being, I think you could make the case that that's the most fundamental of our perceptual categories. Like, I think it's more fundamental than up or down, or black and white, or night and day. Like, and those are very fundamental conceptualizations, right? And so what that implies is that if you can gerrymander the perception of sexual differentiation, if you can do that for ideological reasons, if you can convince people to accept that distortion of reality, there's no distortion of reality that they would be immune to in the aftermath of that violation. So, I mean, I thought about this very deeply since the entire notion of the gender spectrum has emerged into public consciousness. And we've seen the devastating effects of that with regards to medical malpractice, for example. I mean, the best data that I've been able to access now suggests that something approximating 10,000 minor girls in the United States have had double mastectomies that have been paid for by insurance in the aftermath of this gender that's possessed the broader culture. And I think one of the things that the Democrats are most culpable for, and in an unforgivable manner, is still maintaining their support for this view that gender is a spectrum and a continuum. And, it's interesting because, of course, people do vary substantially in their personalities. And there are masculine and feminine personalities, and they're not 100% aligned with the underlying sexual biology. But that doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that the sexual categories are cultural constructs or unreal in any deep sense. So, okay, well, so I've kind of outlined the way that I've been perceiving that. I'm curious about why you picked that as number 2 in your list of topics that need to be addressed, and what brought this to your attention, and what you think the problems and solutions are.
Well, just after number 1 and number 10, there was no particular order to the rest other than making for a good book. So actually, climate change chapter came second. This came a little bit down the line, but that's just a matter of organization in the book. It's a foundational one for exactly the reason you lay out. First of all, you want to trace the evolutionary heritage of gender or of sex, really. It's exactly as you laid out. And you could make the case of how foundational it is relative to other foundational attributes of living creatures. But it is in the category of foundational, regardless. One of the things I explore in this chapter is sometimes it's good to look at the exception that you would hear on the other side as the best argument against you, in my view, and explore that, because, people are going to encounter that. If they don't encounter it in our own discussion, they're going to encounter it elsewhere. So let's take the phenomenon of intersex, as you're familiar, right? So this would be a rare set of genetic anomalies, chromosomal abnormalities, that result in somebody having, rather than ordinarily, just for everyone's benefit, I'm sure most people are aware, two X chromosomes, you're a woman, an X and a Y chromosome, you're a man. That's the definitional distinction for sex on a chromosomal basis in human beings. However, there are rare instances in which individuals are born with and able to survive and live lives approaching normal duration with XXY, XYY, these run by names like Jacob syndrome or Klinefelter syndrome. Now, the fact that we have historically and continue to still describe these as syndromes, and the way that we treat them, historically even related to classifying them as syndromes, I think in many ways reveals that, okay, the fact that that exists and those people deserve to be treated with dignity, and part of our societal approach for nearly all of history to treat them with dignity is to characterize that as a syndrome in a way that's able to be addressed, reveals exactly the point that you were making, which is that it is still foundational, the idea that we have otherwise ordinarily evolved to have two X chromosomes in the human race. You're a woman, and an X and a Y, you're a man. And so I think one of the things I also explored making this, again, part of the point of this book is to make it accessible to ordinary people in the context of otherwise contentious political debates they're having. Let's not accept any of the premises that you and I have just talked about here. Let's not say that you have to subscribe to that out of the gate, or you haven't studied evolutionary biology to be convinced of it, or maybe that doesn't matter to you. It should be at least a little bit of a mystery, a little curious at the very least, that the very now umbrella political movement and cultural movement, the LGBTQIA, there's many letters there, so they put a plus at the end, that LGBTQIA plus movement at once asks you to espouse contradictory claims on this question. So on one hand, the very movement, this umbrella movement, that told you that the sex of the person you're attracted to is hardwired on the day you're born. And by the way, that was a central claim of the gay rights movement. And it was a central claim of the legal argument for why gay rights count as civil rights, that it's an immutable characteristic. The very people who said that the sex of the person you're attracted to on the day you're born also now require you to believe that your own gender, or even in some constructs, your biological sex, is completely fluid over the course of your life. Now, you can't believe both of those things at once, but it becomes even less credible. Now let's just go one layer deeper. That paradox is even more perplexing when you're asked to believe this against the backdrop of there being no gay gene, there's no gay chromosome, but yet that's the attribute that you have to believe is hardwired on the day you're born, or else you're a bigot. And yet, the attribute for which you do have two definitive, measurable, imageable, by karyotyping, empirically discernible. You think about even the chapter of God is real, and people who hold empiricism as even their false God. Fine, apply that here. A discernible, empirically observable reality. And yet to say that that's the attribute, the one that is actually totally mutable over the course of your life, while the one that had no genetic or chromosomal basis, the sex of the person you're attracted to, is the one that somehow had to be immutable. So it becomes serially, I think, more and more ridiculous, or at least untenable, to adopt those contradictory assumptions at once. To say that maybe you could believe one of those things, or you could believe the other of those things. But the postmodern demand is that you believe both of those things at once, which is something that even for somebody who isn't, maybe as drawn to the underlying biological or evolutionary historical truth, could at least acknowledge the hypocrisy of that for the purpose of civil dinner table conversation, which again is part of the purpose of my book, to make some of these concepts a little bit more accessible.
I think it points to the fact that the argument isn't the issue. Like the issue, as far as I can tell, is something like, let's walk through it a little bit and see if we can formulate it. It's something like the presumption that I am going to gerrymander my perceptual and cognitive categories such that at any given moment, I have maximal freedom to pursue whatever form of gratification, sexual and otherwise, that might come to mind. And so if that's my goal, and I think that is the goal of the hedonistic left, is to justify that attitude of pleasure, immediate pleasure seeking at the expense of everything else, then the logical contradictions don't matter. And so if that means sometimes assuming that everything is radically socially constructed so that any constraint placed upon me is just an arbitrary manifestation of the tyrannical patriarchy, well, then I'll accept that when it suits my desire to explore my hedonistic proclivities. And if it means in other circumstances that I have to accept the idea of immutability with regards to sexual attraction, I'll also do that happily, because the real game here is, I think, what's increasingly on display in the pride parades, which is not so much a celebration of the freedom to love, which is, what the democratic good thinkers insist upon, but the freedom to pursue any form of gratification whatsoever, free from any possible constraints of like future or social orientation. I mean, that's what explains the willingness, I think, to swallow these contradictions, because they aren't contradictory at that deeper level. If your desire is that your desires are gratified immediately, regardless of any other consideration, then there is no contradiction at that level of analysis.